welcome to our mushroom crafting time, mycelium crafting time. And yeah, to put these skills into practice, we are going to actually be making a form either molded using a positive and negative shape to create a myco object, or we're going to be sculpting our mycelium material into a free form shape. And to do this, we are actually using a Grow It Yourself kit, also known as a DIY kit. You can find this, source it from Incubate, from Grown Bio. You can simply use a Grow It Yourself medicinal mushroom kit if that's what's available in your area, and it'll work just as well. Let's begin. So, in case you haven't had tied your hair back, first things first, people with long hair, let's tie the hair back. Make sure the surfaces are nice and clean, nice and sterile. You've got your gloves on, you've got your masks ready. Mine is backwards. The surface, another little spray. And as you can see here, we're not in our lab space, meaning this table is not our sterile metal surface. So we've actually covered it with like a plastic cover that you can reuse every time that you do one of these practices or experiments. Just make sure you wipe it clean between each time. And we're working with metal bowls and glass bowls because, again, we can easily spray those with 70% alcohol and wipe them clean to sterilize all of those surfaces as well and keep our sterile workflow, even though we're in a pretty open area. Because these Grow It Yourself kits are so strong, the strains are so strong, there's really little chance of contamination. So we're going to begin by breaking up the material. You may, depending on how old the material is, you may find that it can be pretty strong. So ideally start making big chunks and then work your way down to get as fine chunks as possible. The smaller the chunks, the more you break it up, the easier it will be to create your form. So why are we using a Grow It Yourself kit for this demo? Well, the material is pretty indestructible. I think it's one of the easiest things to start using if you're working with Myco-materials. To get you familiar with the way the material feels, how to mold it, without risk of anything going wrong. This company uses hemp husk. So pretty similar thread to what we've been using through this whole time in our studio, and what you probably have been able to find at home might be a little bit different if you're using your own substrate. So just keep in mind that the ratios of water and of any additives, like we'll be adding some different flours and starches to this mix, might be a little bit different for you. So we want to break this up really small, and this might take you a little while depending on how strong the mycelium is in your material, as you can kind of tell here by the way that our mycelium is kind of super binded to all of this hemp. Yeah, it makes it a little bit more difficult to break it up smaller, but it's going to make the texture of your object a lot smoother, and it's going to allow you to create a more malleable material to put into your mold. So it's really important that you break up all the skin bits, if it's grown as skin or membrane on the surface, and that you try to break it up into as small pieces as you can. This will also allow you to compact the material into your mold a lot easier. Also worth noting, it's good practice to make sure that your head is not over the bowl when doing this process. It feels natural to want to kind of lean over the material, but as with everything that we've been practicing throughout the course, try and keep a bit of a distance. We don't want any of the skin cells or the hair, or the dust falling onto your material. Fun!
10 years later. Yeah. We've grown old by the time that this has.
Literally.
We are coming to you from the year 2032. And we're finally ready to put it our mycelium into our molds. Amazing. So when your mix starts to look like this, this means you have been breaking it up for quite a long time now, and you actually no longer see the white skin, that mycelium, because it's broken up so little all throughout. So what really shows is the substrate mostly. Don't worry, your mycelium is still in there. It's just that it's spread out throughout the entire substrate, which is what we want.
Now it's time to add the flour. In this case, we're going to be using brown rice flour. The amount that we're going to be putting in is going to be dependent on what we're making. So I'm going to be making a mold, and well, it's a cocktail holder, a glass cocktail holder. And Kat is going to be molding or sculpting
something that's a surprise to me. So, the reason why we need flour as a mix is so that we can add some extra nutrients, some new nutrients for this new phase of growth of our mycelium. In this case, the starch also helps to act as a bit of a binder so that we can more easily sculpt this material into the shape that we want, whether that is just compacting it into a mold or freehand sculpting. If you want to start doing this on your own and want to understand the feel and the different types of composite materials that you can create, it's really beneficial to write down the amounts that you're using, either by teaspoons or by weight, using a measuring scale, a kitchen scale, just so that you have an understanding once you complete a lot of these as exercises, what you're looking for in a material, and then you can easily replicate or tweak and alter that recipe for the future.
Because we've done this so many times, we kind of have a feel for it already, so it tends to be a lot of adding, playing, feeling the material, and then deciding whether that's the consistency that you want to be using for your particular mold or sculpting. It's always best to add the dry ingredient first, mix it well throughout the substrate, and then add a little bit of distilled water. Also, this would depend on how moist your substrate is already. So if you're finding your substrate quite dry, you can add a little bit more water. If it feels quite moist already, then you probably don't need to add too much. In my case, I think I don't need to add too much, but I'm going to add a little bit.
And so we're approaching this in two different ways. Jess is making molds and filling in a mold, and I am going to be free sculpting the material into different shapes, I think, just like for funsies. And for that, I'm gonna need something that's more has a resemblance to a sculptural material. So what do I mean by that? When I make a little ball in my fist with the material and I let it go, if it stays in that shape, that's really good, because we're looking at it to be almost like a clay-like malleability or a Play-Doh kind of material without letting it get too pasty and wet. So it's definitely less is more, starting with a little bit of water, with a little bit of flour, and then as you massage the material and integrate all of the components, just every now and then check that, number one, your fuel capacity is still good, meaning that you're not squeezing out droplets of water out of the material. That means it's too wet and you might have to add more material into the mix to sort of salvage it. And number two, just start making little balls or little fistfuls of material and see if it stays in the shape that you like. Like at this point, you could probably use this for molding, even maybe for sculpting, but I think it's still a little bit brittle and I would add a little bit more water. And another trick that we use is using a kind of cooking gum. This one is xanthan gum. Oh no, this one's guar gum, but you can use xanthan gum also. They're very similar. They're basically just thickeners or gellants and will allow like a more slippery, malleable surface to bind our material as we work with it and sculpt with it. So I'm just gonna add a pinch into this mix. Or more. And go from there.
So right now, my material has the brown rice flour and the water added to it. As I'm not going to be sculpting, as I'm just going to be compacting the material into a mold, I'd say that this is pretty perfect. It still has some moisture. The starch-based flour is well distributed throughout the substrate. And I'm good to go. So, next, here we have the mold. First things first, as always, we clean our space, we clean any equipment or tools that we're going to be using.
So as a side note for your space setup, you might want to have a bowl or some kind of recipient where you can put your used paper towels, anything that you're going to just want to clear out of the way quickly without touching too many other surfaces at arm's reach. And that makes your cleanup a lot easier at the end as well.
Definitely. So just a note, here is the mold. Because the mold that I'm going to be using isn't very flexible, it is plastic, so it has a nice smooth surface. But because it's not flexible, it's going to be very hard for the material to pop out easily. In this case, I'm going to be using cling film or plastic wrap. It's not ideal, it's not the preferred way to do it, but this is the mold that I'm going to be using. If you have a more flexible plastic mold, then that's easier to just pop the material out of the mold when it's grown. The reason why
a silicone mold.
A silicone mold also works well. Plastic flexible packaging works well. Once the material is completely remyceliated, it's still going to be humid and it's still going to be quite fragile. So the best way to remove it from the mold is to just very carefully pop it out with the cling film. Now we are searching for better ways to do this. Maybe you have a thicker plastic sheet that you can reuse, which would be ideal. Or alternatively, if you want to make your own mold with silicone, then that can be reused multiple times. So as you can see now, I have a piece of cling film inside of the mold. So I'm going to be just pressing this down, compacting this. You can compact it as much or as little as you like. Of course, if you want a nice strong material, the more you compact it, the better. Worth noting, so in this case, the material is already myceliated, so it's already evenly distributed throughout the substrate. meaning it should have uniform growth throughout, provided we add adequate air holes. Okay, so I have the base ready. Because my design involves a nice smooth glass finished piece, basically what I'm going to be doing is I want this is going to be part of the design. So I'm going to add this to the middle, press down gently into where exactly I'm going to want to put it. In this case it's going to be in the middle, and then I'm going to add my material on the outside. So this is actually a new concept for a cocktail cup, a cocktail glass, in a mycelium material plate. So I want to try and get the material to be spread out as evenly as possible before I compact it too much. Okay, so it's also, if you're finding it quite tricky with your fingers to compress, you can also use a metal or plastic spoon or something with a flat surface to smoothen out the top of the object, depending on the desired finish. Again, you want to keep it quite compressed. The more it's compressed, the stronger the material is going to be. And you can fill it up as much as you want. So this is the same process as if you were to make a little plant pot or a candle holder. I've got it nice, compact, and where I want it to be positioned inside the container, smoothing out the top by gently compressing. Okay, once that's ready, I'm going to place a piece of cling film on top of it. Again, if you have an alternative material to this, a more reusable plastic would be ideal, but it's also nice to be able to see your substrate growing, checking if there's any contamination or if anything is going wrong. Close it. Okay, so here we're just going to tape it up. So the reason why we want to tape it up and keep it covered is so that we can allow the mycelium to keep growing in a humid environment. If you were to just leave it out, it would probably start to grow but then eventually dry out. Keep note of the substrate, the type of material we're using. In this case, this is grown bio, so I'm going to just label it GB. The date, and that should be it. We want it to allow it to continue to breathe a little bit, as it was doing in the mushroom grow bags. So we're just going to give it some tiny little air holes, evenly placed around the mold. And then depending on the size of your mold, you may find it useful to put some air holes at the bottom. I've actually done this process before and I haven't had to use some air holes in the bottom, but it's good practice to do so. So I'm just going to demonstrate how we do this. So we're going to heat up the needle. You can do this with a pin and sewing needle, just a sharp object really, and then pierce. And here we are. This is ready. So depending on the ambient temperature, this should take roughly 2 to 3 days to grow, or you'll start seeing the mycelium reform, and then you can remove it from its mold. Once you've removed it from its mold, you're able to perform the second incubation, or you can decide that maybe you want to dehydrate it directly. It really just depends on your desired outcome. So I actually have more material than I thought, so I'm going to do some sculpting too.
Just being very delicate, very gentle. There's a couple of ways that you can allow these to grow. I mean, the smaller pieces can just be hanging out because they're not touching or anything. They can just be hanging out in this bowl, and I can cover it with a lid if I have a plastic lid that I can put some holes into, or with some saran wrap.
Yeah, I just put mine in a Tupperware box.
Yeah.
Whenever, if I'm making something that's sculpted that's quite big.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically or like if I find a surface, like a flat, smooth, hard surface, like a movable surface.
Yeah, like a tray.
Like a tray, exactly. And then I would just make it on top of that, and then cover it in some way, whether that's like an upside down box or a piece of wrap.
And that's it. We'll see you on the flip side of this madness.